I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where we're meeting tonight. Look, I thought just following on from David's talk about the Chisholm program and what's been happening in New South Wales, I'd make a couple of comments about the national situation, because it is a national problem. Sure, the states and the territories each have individual responsibility for the way juvenile justice operates within each state, but the problem is when we look nationally we see these sorts of issues replicated. So if we go back to Don Dale in the Northern Territory and what we saw there in relation to the assaults, the tear gassing of children, placing children in restraint chairs and so on. Yeah, as a response to that, the federal government announced the Royal Commission in the Northern Territory in July 2016 after all the CCTV footage was broadcast on Four Corners. Within 2 weeks of the announcement of that Royal Commission in the Northern Territory, the Queensland government also announced an independent review of youth detention in that state following a whole range of allegations of excessive force against detainees. And within a matter of another 3 to 4 weeks, the New South Wales government, the Victorian government and the Tasmanian government also announced inquiries into various aspects and similar problems in their detention centres. So just within that short period from July 2016 through to around October 2016, we had first of all the Northern Territory, then the Queensland government, Tasmanian government, Victorian government and New South Wales government, all facing quite similar, not exactly the same, but quite similar problems in relation to the treatment of young people in detention. And it seems to me that what we take from that really is that these problems are not isolated incidents, they're not particular to one state or territory, but they really highlight the problem of systemic issues within the way we treat, in Australia, within the way we treat young people that are locked up. And if we look over the last 5 or 6 years, we see a range of recurrent themes. The ones that I've just identified in terms of inquiries have just been since July 2016, but if we look over 5 or 6 years, we see a whole range of inquiries, investigations and reports around the treatment of children in detention. And looking through all of those, what I've got is really a summary of 17 issues that constantly re-emerge. Not always at the same time in the same jurisdiction, the state and territory, but they constantly re-emerge. And the first one is this use of segregation and isolation that David's described in relation to the Chisholm program in New South Wales. The use of segregation and isolation are the words that the departments use for what happens, but really they do amount to, as David's already indicated, solitary confinement for children. That's the first one. The second one is the excessive use of force by staff and intimidation by staff. Constant allegations around that issue. And the third one is assaults and physical abuse by staff. So there's the excessive use of force and then separate from that, actual assaults by staff. There's problems around the use of mechanical restraints, as they're somewhat euphemistically called, but the image of Dylan Voller in the Northern Territory being strapped into a restraint chair with a hood over his head is an example of what is referred to as a mechanical restraint. There's been problems in relation to the staff supply of contraband to young detainees. There's been issues around staff inciting fights between detainees. There's been problems in relation to overcrowding in detention centres. There's been problems in the failure to separate children from adult prisoners, particularly when they've been transferred into the adult system. There's been high levels of self-harm. There's been a recurring problem in relation to detention. Some of the other issues are severely stretched mental health facilities in detention centres, and I'll come back to that issue briefly. Problem in relation to strip searches. Again, that's been an issue in relation to both the Northern Territory, Western Australia, Victoria. Poor visiting facilities or restrictions on visitors, as we've seen in the Common Program in New South Wales, but also in other states and territories. Inadequate qualities of food. Again, David mentioned the problems in relation to finger food in New South Wales, but also poor quantities of food's been an issue that's recurred in detention in Victoria. Under-resourced educational facilities, lack of programs and recreational facilities, poor case management of young people that are detained, and poorly trained custodial staff. And that's an issue that's particularly emerged in the Northern Territory. So as I've said, not all of those problems are evident in every jurisdiction, every state and territory at any one time, but they're the recurring problems that we can see just looking over the last 5 or 6 years across the country. I want to say a little bit in particular about the use of segregation and isolation of children in detention, because as David's already indicated, it is an issue of particular relevance to New South Wales. And clearly practices of segregation and isolation, when they're occurring for 23 hours a day, amount to de facto solitary confinement. And that really is one of the enduring features of the way juveniles are being detained in Australia at the moment. Similar problems to New South Wales in relation to this use of segregation and isolation have been identified in Queensland, Victoria, the Northern Territory and Western Australia over the recent years. So to give just one example of Western Australia in 2013, and this was the subject of an investigation by the Prison Inspectorate in Western Australia. So in 2013, 73 children were transferred from the Juvenile Detention Centre there, the Banksia Hill Detention Centre, to the adult prison, Huckia Prison, following an inmate disturbance. Once they were placed in the adult prison, they were subject to, according to the Inspectorate of Prisons in WA, they were subject to long periods of lockdown, 23 hours a day with only 1 hour of exercise, and handcuffed during that 1 hour, replicating the more recent problems identified in New South Wales. Extensive use of physical restraints, strip searching, and limited access to education and rehabilitation programs. If we fast forward from 2013 in WA to 2016 in Victoria, what happens in Victoria is very reminiscent of what had happened a couple of years earlier in Western Australia. Following a disturbance in the Melbourne Youth Justice Centre in late 2016, a number of children, about 15 children I believe, were moved to a segregated wing of the maximum security prison, Barwon adult prison, and again, similar situation, held for long periods of time in isolation. If we move from there to New South Wales and the description David's given of the Chisholm program, one of the interesting things I think, and one of the disturbing things about New South Wales, was that the use of isolation and segregation or solitary confinement for children in New South Wales didn't arise because those children had been transferred into an adult prison, but it was actually part of a systemic regulated program. So this was the normalised use of isolation, segregation or solitary confinement. So if you look at Western Australia or Victoria and the problem of solitary confinement of juveniles there, of young people there, that was argued by the departments on the basis of a crisis. There'd been a disturbance, kids had been transferred to the adult system, and that was the rationale given for the use of solitary confinement. Now, I'm not suggesting that actually justifies it, but it's quite different from the situation in New South Wales, where the use of isolation and segregation, solitary confinement, actually becomes a routine part of the operation of the way in which the juvenile justice system is operating. And it's based on a particular program of behaviour modification. So behaviour modification for these troublesome young people is the justification for the routine use of solitary confinement. And David's already talked about the Chisholm program. I won't say much more about it other than a couple of points. David's mentioned that 2/3 of the young people were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. We had instances of one child being held in isolation for 100 days in a row, another one being held for 166 days out of a 10-month period. So it's extensive use of isolation. And some of those children were also children with cognitive impairments, mental health issues and cognitive impairments. And I don't think it takes a great deal of imagination to understand the impact of the use of solitary confinement on children in that situation. The only other thing I'd say about the Chisholm program in particular, and it's following on from the point that David made about the closing down of the program after the Ombudsman had initiated an investigation, was the department, and this arises from the documentation that came through the FOI process. The department itself had a briefing note from March 2016, which actually identified many of these problems with this Chisholm program, around the fact of the lack of case management, the fact that there was no rehabilitative focus, that the program, the behaviour modification program, didn't follow best practice in terms of trying to deal with young people with particular problems. The fact that young people with mental health issues or cognitive impairments in particular would have trouble understanding that progress through all those phases that David's already identified. The fact that they'd simply adopted this practice from the Carry-On Detention Centre, which had been closed down. And the whole program itself was inconsistent with what's referred to as trauma-informed practice. That is, a practice that actually tries to build on the strengths of young people rather than punishing them for wrongdoing, which is what the Chisholm program is based on. So we've got a range of current inquiries going on. The New South Wales Inspector of Prisons is looking into these issues, and they won't report for another few months yet. The Queensland Government released its review report about 3 or 4 weeks ago. The Northern Territory Royal Commission is still going on. That won't report until August of this year. So where do we go, leaving aside the fact that these reports, except for the Queensland one, haven't come out yet? I mean, where do we go in terms of thinking about what to do in relation to these issues? One important point is the issue around monitoring. On the face of it, Australia seems to have a very good system of monitoring. We've got every agency under the sun monitoring juvenile detention centres. We've got children's commissions, we've got ombudsman's offices, we've got official visitors, and so on. And yet these problems recur. I think one of the important points here is that Australia has signed what's referred to as the optional protocol for the Convention Against Torture, but it hasn't ratified it yet. That requires the federal government to establish a national preventative mechanism. That is, a national body for the monitoring and review of what's happening in all places of detention, and that includes juvenile detention. Because the problem that we've got at the moment, we've got this range of agencies which have differing responsibilities, differing powers. Many of them rely on a complaints-based process. Now, complaints-based processes pose particular problems for children. The Queensland report that just came out recently found that when they went to the Townsville Detention Centre, that the average reading age of children in that detention centre was that of a 7-year-old. Now, to expect young people in that sort of situation to be able to effectively use a complaints-based mechanism, I think is completely unrealistic. The obligation of the federal government to set up a national preventative mechanism, which will arise once, if and when they ratify this protocol, is a much more proactive body. It requires reporting directly, it requires independence, statutory independence and reporting to Parliament. It's a much more independent body than what we have in most places within Australia. There's a whole range of areas that we don't have consistent reporting on. We don't know in any systematic way what the use of mechanical restraints are in relation to young people. The only reason we know about the situation of Dylan Voller in the Northern Territory is because of the Four Corners process. There's no systematic reporting on the use of these restraints. There's no systematic reporting on things like strip searches of young people, children, in detention. There's no systematic reporting on the use of segregation and isolation or solitary confinement. The only reason we know something about it now in relation to New South Wales has been because of the proactive work of people like David and others in terms of getting the FOI, freedom of information, the information that arose from the FOI process. So I think all of those are important, and hopefully the establishment of a national body would reduce the occurrence and provide for better accountability. But I think we also need to remember that it's not going to ensure that these abuses don't occur. There will still be abuses irrespective of a national monitoring body. We've seen consistently governments ignore the results or the recommendations from inquiries. The Northern Territory government was completely aware of what was going on in Don Dale. The Children's Commissioner had alerted them to what was happening there a number of times. It was only the Four Corners investigation and the publication of those images that really sparked the federal government to intervene. Similarly in New South Wales, David mentioned the closing down of Carry On. There were complaints and reports about Carry On for a decade and a half before the government finally decided to close Carry On Detention Centre. And of course after they closed it, they simply transferred both the children and the problem of the way they dealt with those children to Cobble. So it seems to me that having a national preventative mechanism, that is a national body to ensure accountability, is really important. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the political responses of governments to those reports and inquiries as to whether things change or not. So I want to finish up by saying, well, you know, reporting is important, accountability is important, but I think this ties back to where David started. What's most important is reducing the number of children we have in detention. And that's an issue not just for New South Wales, it's an issue nationally. And there's 4 points I just want to make in relation to that. First of all, we have a very high remand population amongst young people that are detained at the moment across Australia. So about just under 60% of all children that are locked up in Australia are there on remand. They haven't been sentenced, they've been there because bail's been refused or they've breached bail, so they're unsentenced, being held as a result of that. And that's something we can do, that can be changed relatively easily, either in relation to changes to bail legislation, to changes to overzealous police monitoring of compliance with bail conditions, and that's a whole story in itself which I won't go into, but we've had plenty of examples of young people being unreasonably breached in relation to bail and being held in detention as a result of that. And the third point in terms of changing that is to provide support for children on bail in the community. Second point is reducing Aboriginal overrepresentation. As we've already mentioned, over 50% of young people that are locked up in Australia at the moment are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. And there's been enough reports to fill this room about how changes can be made to that. So it seems to me that if you reduce the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children, if you reduce the number of children on remand, you'd have a very, very different situation in relation to juvenile detention in Australia, in terms of substantially reducing the number, particularly in relation to bail, because kids come in and out of the system on bail for relatively short periods of time, and that poses a whole range of problems. Third point I just want to make is we also need alternatives to custody for children in juvenile detention centres that have mental health issues and or cognitive impairments. The prevalence of children that are locked up with mental health issues and or cognitive impairment is very well established. We've had survey after survey of young people in custody in New South Wales that shows that, so I'm just trying to find figures here, between 83 and 88% of young people in custody have some sort of psychological disorder, and around 15 to 18% have some sort of intellectual disability. We also know that there are large numbers of young people that are sort of borderline in relation to cognitive disabilities, and that might arise through things like fetal alcohol syndrome, fetal alcohol spectrum syndrome, traumatic brain injury, as well as other problems in relation to speech impairments, language impairments. And so we really need to think about what we can do that's better than locking up children that have these issues. Fourth point, and the final one, is that we need to increase the minimum age of criminal responsibility. Now, across Australia, the minimum age at which a child can be held criminally responsible for their actions is 10. And Australia is really out of line with prevailing practice in relation to this. The average minimum age of criminal responsibility across the European Union is 14 years. So there is an absolute presumption that a child who's under that age cannot commit a criminal offence. If there are issues, they are dealt with as welfare and support issues rather than through the processes of the criminal justice system. And just following on from the European Union, there's a survey recently of 86 countries, and again, the average age was 14 years. And the trend has been for the age to increase. So Australia is really lagging in relation to the minimum age of criminal responsibility. And it seems to me that what that does by raising the age to 14 or higher, some of the European jurisdictions have a higher age than 14, 15, 16 years of age. What that does is actually provide the opportunity to address the problems that children have, to address those problems without resorting to the criminal justice system, but rather to see them as welfare and care needs. And to go back to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has been critical of Australia because of its low age of criminal responsibility, and has argued that Australia needs to raise that age. Part of the work that I've been doing with others at the University of New South Wales has been involved with interviewing young people, but also interviewing staff that work in juvenile justice. And most of the staff that we've interviewed, not just in New South Wales, but in Queensland, Victoria, and also in WA, excuse me, are quite supportive of raising the age. There may not be much political support, but many of the people that work in juvenile justice also feel that this age of 10 is too young. We've spoken to people that work in juvenile detention centres, and they'll say quite openly they don't want 10 or 11 or 12-year-old children in detention. As one of them said to us when we interviewed them, you might have a child that's chronologically of the age of 10 or 11 or 12, but when you look into their eyes, you can see that their real age is probably 7 or 8. And I think it's an issue that really needs to be addressed. So look, that's the final point. Just to answer the kind of topic that you said about whether the New South Wales government's ignoring torture or not. Well, look, the use of solitary confinement. I mean, I'd leave it up to the human rights lawyers to argue whether extensive solitary confinement or not of children meets the threshold of torture. But the convention also prohibits cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment, and it certainly meets that threshold anyway, if not that of torture. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Please thank both the speakers. It's really very profound and strong presentations we've had on this topic.